How you doing, Kevin? You want to talk
What's
about
going on, guys?
How you doing? Pronouns are he, him. You want to talk about God's morality is better than the morality people conceived of? Is that right?
Not exactly. I guess I have a question, and based on the answer, would lead me down the path what I was going for. So, if I could start there really quickly.
Sure, go for it.
Something I hear echoed a lot is, that our morality is better than God's. People, like if we were to just ask ourselves questions, do we think this is right, this is wrong? And it seems like, if we seem to be, I don't know, our head is on straight more than God's is, what do we really need them for? And my question, I guess, is where does that come from? Like that process of thinking, we don't really need God, or whatever definition of what his morality would be described as if we have our own. What justifies that?
Yeah, can I jump on this a little bit? So
Yeah.
for me, one of the avenues of understanding more about the world that really helped me drop all of my faith claims and all the belief in the supernatural and religion stuff was actually going about looking up different philosophical moral systems. Okay. So it was me spending quite a lot of time reading through, deontological ethics, right? Learning about all this stuff with Kant. There's actually a series of letters that a woman named Maria von Herbert wrote to Kant while he was still alive. And I think you find out some of the most fascinating stuff about Kant's views on morality through those letters. They're really, really interesting. But anyway, that understanding for me that there actually is a way to get justification for doing certain actions or not doing other actions that has absolutely nothing to do with God. That was a huge moment for me, Kevin, because up until that point, I had just never gone through the process of even thinking about it. And what I soon came to realize was the bullet points that are laid out for me in, say, I don't know, something that Jeremy Bentham wrote, for like a basic utilitarianism. Okay. Mm-hmm. Nothing crazy, nothing super deep here, but those bullet points, when compared to the bullet points that I was getting repeatedly from the Bible, I see more benefit and less harm in that framework. And for me, when I started to understand this idea of, pleasure versus pain, harm versus beneficence, I started to see that in every single moral system out there. And this is purely just from me, Kevin. I'm not saying anybody else thinks this way, but for me, I see that calculation played out in every moral system, period, end of sentence. The only reason to do the things that God wants you to do is for the benefit that God will give you afterwards, or to avoid the harm that God will inflict on you. And so because I started seeing that pattern everywhere, what that said to me was, hey, maybe I need to reevaluate this system. And in the process of doing that, I look at a moral system that does not talk about God whatsoever, and I look at all the moral systems I've ever seen that have God to do with it. And these come out with way less harm and way more benefit, time and time and time again. And I think that's just something that a lot of us have done. It's not very hard, in my opinion, to go from, I think smashing babies' heads on rocks is bad, to any conscious agent, any moral actor that does that is by definition bad. God did that, done and done. So hopefully that's something for us to at least start off with.
Well, no, I follow that 100%, and cool. So that brings me to where I have the overall dilemma, which is why I called. I could see where, when you're putting that together, you're talking about less harm. So if I made a scenario and I said, okay, let's just say I put the 10 Commandments down right now, okay, and I try to take a moral path that has nothing to do with God. And I walked outside and I said, hey, I'm going to spend 365 days asking every lovely human being what is okay and what's not okay. Can I slap a woman in the face on the side of the street? Can I crash my car at somebody when I get mad? Just, a bunch of questions that I feel like I would get some pretty decent answers for most of us out here anyway. And I came at the end of the day at 365 days and I said, okay, I think I know how to be a pretty good human being from what people have told me. Where I have an issue with that is in 200 years, aren't all those answers going to be different in the next 1,000? And my favorite
not necessarily.
subject.
Hang on real quick, Kevin, because I think it's important, and I'll let you finish up, I swear. But I think we can just undermine that very quickly, because not necessarily. Because if we're assuming that life has these basic attributes that exist currently, that we ascribe to it, if we're assuming that those attributes will continue, because that's the most reasonable assumption based on the data that we have currently, it's not that definite life will always be like this. But if we are saying, based on the evidence that we have currently, it is reasonable to assume that in the future, life will also have similar attributes, then I don't see why those particular aspects of the moral system would necessarily change, right? If we're just assuming that cells do what cells do 500 years from now, which seems to be logical because they did it a bunch in the past, and that's all the evidence we've got, right? So they wouldn't necessarily change, but some things could based on what we discover, right?
Okay. And that leads me to the examples. And if I don't have to go back 100 years, and I don't have to bring out the long laundry list. You guys are pretty educated, but I'm thinking to myself, there were some pretty horrendous things that were okay 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And even though I am a pro-lifer, I would never make a law about that. And here we are, even in 2023, they're trying to make laws regarding that. Regardless of how I feel, I wouldn't take those steps, but they are. And I don't think we really
Evan, how is
that coming.
How is this any different though with your view, potentially with because if God just commands that it's okay to throw a child off a building, do you is it going to be good in virtue of his commands from your view, or because I seem like the thing that you're pointing out's a problem might just be the exact problem on your view, right?
And we actually have good evidence to suggest that God has done that changey thing, right? That's the whole reason that slavery's in the Bible, is because God just couldn't get rid of it. He had to work it down slowly over the years to work with the people. So we've already got evidence that your system really hardcore changes.
Yeah, so Kevin, do you think that his commands, what is good is in virtue of his commands?
Instead of sugarcoating it, just how I've been brought up, of course not. I've got a lot of issues with what God asked and what's in the Bible. Even though I'm definitely a theist, I'm not going to make excuses for a lot of the things that I
appreciate your honesty.
Knee jerk. Okay, so I appreciate that. Makes me uncomfortable. Thank you, and I want you guys. I guess this is the crux of my question here. What makes me sit very uncomfortable is, all right, I don't have confidence in us, because I feel like we have shown to not have confidence in us. And even though, and you guys might appreciate this is a little thing that I've created. I always tell my wife, we're not in a movie. This is a time we live in right now. And if we could jump in a time machine and listen to the conversations that people had in the past, we'd probably sit there and be like, you guys are fucking crazy. But they didn't think so. Yeah. And I don't think so, but I worry, how reliable are we to really assume that it's going to stay like that? And that's where I lose confidence in us. And although God,
let me ask this. Do you think, Kevin, do you think tomorrow multiplication will be different? Do you think the basics of mathematics will be the same tomorrow?
I believe so.
Yeah, me too. Do you think you have a good reason to accept that? Do you think there's at least something that you can kind of, maybe not perfect, but hey, it's probably 1 + 1 is still going to equal 2 tomorrow, you know, and 500 years in the future. Like, does that seem reasonable to you?
It just seems very hard to change that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. And to go back to kind of where we were talking with the previous caller, right, about those most fundamental things that we're assuming. You and I are assuming that. we don't have any choice, Kevin. We can't get out of that. We're kind of stuck in that boat where we just have to assume some things, right, about the laws of logic. Like, we just can't do anything but. And I think what we've done over the millennia as intelligent social creatures is we have really honed in on those basics to such a degree that we really are pretty knowledgeable, and we do really have a good understanding. And it's not to say that we can't discover new things tomorrow. Abso-freaking-lutely possible. But as the years go on, and as all of the consequences from these assumptions continue to play out time and time and time again, that kind of says to me that the likelihood of such a radical change of absolutely everything probably isn't likely, whether it's 5 years from now or 5,000 years from now. Because probably in 5,000 years from now, maybe they don't do call-in shows anymore on YouTube, but probably there's going to be a conversation where somebody says, but how do you know you're not a brain in a vat? Because we've been having that conversation for 2,000 years, you know? And so I guess for me, it's that, hey, yeah, we could find out something tomorrow that really does shake up biology for us, but it's more and more unlikely as we continue stacking the evidence that we're going to find something that just radically changes absolutely everything, and that all of our past information was just flat out wrong. Does that kind of make sense? It's like we've just stacked up so much on this side now that to undermine all of that would be so radical of a shift that it seems to me the less likely option.
I follow that. You know, ultimately you're saying we've got a couple of things on this fundamental checklist that we kind of know, all right, like you said, we're probably not going to throw babies off of roofs in 400 years. Right. I would hope you're right.
Yeah, me too.
Ultimately.
Me too.
Well,
that's just something. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I didn't want to interrupt you. I apologize.
No, all I was saying was that's something I just toggle with, is that when I look through the past, I worry, you know, could we go on a downward spiral again? And if so, when we hear ourselves talk, you know, how much confidence do we have? But, you know, if you're going to take the approach that, listen, you know, we've kind of got these baseline things together, then, you know, I would agree with that. You know, I would hope it stays that way, but sure.
Yeah. And so this is, I guess, the thing that I'm thinking of, that maybe, I don't know if this might matter to you or not, but this might piggyback off secular in a sense. I think there's a reason that secular and myself might be convinced that you won't get this radical shift, at least in opinion, or that the progression we're going to, it seems have a pretty strict pattern, at least right at this point, that we're identifying. And one of the reasons I think that this is the case is because what we do is, when we look at an action like a baby being thrown off a building, we look at the intrinsic relations that are involved with that, the things that are intrinsic to that, like the suffering, the relationships that are tarnished, the trauma, right? All of this stuff, people that can't finish their projects because of the trauma, right? All of this cascading effect. Now, compare that though to the view that you might be sympathetic towards, which is going to be that God, all God really needs to do is come up to any set of anything, any descriptive set of whatever, sprinkle good salt or bad salt on it, and that thing is what it is. There's the factors in play for the good and the evil in that view aren't intrinsic to the actions, right? Because if they were, that's all you would need, right? And so it's your concern seems to be flipped in a sense that on your view, it's like it's only good if God does this kind of imbuing onto something, right? like some extrinsic type of relation to it. Whereas that seems absurd because you can make anything good or anything bad. And now we're talking about like this mafioso, you know, boss mob, you know, obedience to whatever it is, as opposed to looking at the intrinsic actions, the relations between those, and then saying, yeah, that's wrong. Like, I'm not a moral realist, but I'm under the presumption that it's always wrong, no matter what, to hurt a child, right? That's my view. It's my subjective view. I'd love to find out that there's a fact in the world that, you know, makes that true. But the thing that's important about the subjectivist in that case is they're at least looking at the intrinsic actions and making a type of analysis given that. Whereas the other one, it's like tomorrow it could just new salt sprinkled and the analysis never really mattered, right? Because now it's the opposite. And so I don't know if that makes sense.
I think Kevin, that's a good point. I think that was a good point.
No, it makes perfect sense. You know, there is a lot of and I've heard you talk about that before, JMike, is ultimately that you would just have to call that good if God leaves it at that, and that's just what it is. You know, even if it means there are repercussions that are going to come with it that could affect many people in a negative way, but ultimately you believe God is good all the time. So that is what it is. There's no passing that. And I listen, I appreciate the time you guys have given me. I'm not going to hold you anymore. I just want to say thanks, because I don't get the opportunity to have these kind of conversations. And although I believe what I believe, if I've got a question, I just want it answered. But what I'm not going to do is make excuses for what I believe. And I do wish most theists would stop doing that. If we're following
Kevin, you have called so many times. You've called so many times, and I've loved every conversation. You're my genuinely my favorite caller that calls in that's on the opposite side. I genuinely appreciate you, because you do see you're looking at these different ways. We're both trying to have a productive conversation. I love that. It's a great thing. If you were ever in the metro Atlanta area and you wanted to grab a drink, I'd love to talk about this stuff in person, man. So I genuinely like talking to you as well. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.